So today we are going to talk about arrays. Arrays form a very important part in coding. So when you're coding, there will be lots and lots and lots of problem statements that can be solved using arrays. So we will talk about arrays in Java today. We will see what are arrays, what are the problem statement that array is solving, and how do we use an array. So let's start with talking about arrays. So let's say I have a problem statement that I have to store marks of two students and check whose marks is greater. So when I get a problem statement like this, what will I do? I will have two variables, marks 1 and marks 2, and I will go on to write a program that if marks 1 is greater than marks 2, I will print marks 1, else I will print marks 2. Simple, right? So this is the case when we have just two variables with us. Now let's say I change the problem statement to some extent, because in real life what happens is that we just don't have two students in a class. We have more than that. So let's see, I have a problem statement to store marks of 100 students in a class and check who got the highest marks. Now, if I go by the approach that we followed right back, what will I do? I will have 100 variables. I will have marks 1, marks 2, marks 3. So I will have 100 variables to take care of. So if we see just this particular approach, first of all, having 100 variables, declaring and defining 100 variables in itself is a tedious task. Now let's say we do that task. We go on and declare 100 variables, but now the question is, how do I get the highest marks? Because how do you do the comparison? In just 2 marks, what you did, you just checked that whichever is the greatest and you printed it. But if we go on to do the comparisons between these 100 marks, it is going to be lots and lots of complications would be there. And let's say what happens if tomorrow we have to take care of 100 to 2000 or 1000 or 10,000 students. In that case, are you going to just store 1000 variables? Are you going to have that of comparison? So I think you cannot even imagine a program like that, right? So now the question is, we have a problem statement, how do I do that? So the answer to such questions, when we have to store lots of data, so the answer to this question is arrays. So this is where arrays come in picture. So let's go on to first understand what is an array. So the first question we are talking about here is, what is an array? So I have just shown a picture here. So if you think of graphical representation of an array, this is how array will look. So even when you're writing the code and you're drawing array in your notebook, this is what you're going to, this is how you will represent it. This is the graphical representation. So in this case, this is an array. So just this is just the graphical representation. Now let's try to understand that what this graphical representation means. So talking about the typical definition of an array is a data structure that stores a collection of values of the same data type stored in continuous memory location. So it might seem like a very big definition, right? So let's break this down into parts. So let's first go to, an array is a data structure. So, generally we come across the word data structure, we think that we must be talking about something that is really difficult. So if I won't get into the depth of data structure, I'll tell you in a very simple way that what is a data structure. So data structure is all about storing data. So again, we have lots of data with ourselves. We'll be coding every now and then, we'll be handling data, we'll be manipulating data. So in this case, what we have to do is we have to store 100 raw numbers and we have to find which is the largest one. So as you can see that if we go on to store 100 raw numbers using variables, things become very complicated. So we need some data structure so that we can organize our data in a way such that coming out with the highest number or performing a particular operation is very easy. So data structure, just forget about the complications. Just remember one thing. Data structure is just about way of storing data such that our operations become very easy. That is what we are doing here, right? So we are storing data, and here our data is marks of students. So we have 100 students, we have 1000 students, and we have to store their marks. So for the use case that we have to store 100 and 1000 marks, and we have to get the highest one, array is a suitable data structure. Now we'll talk about why array is a suitable data structure. So the very first part, I hope, is clear that an array is a data structure. Now let's go to the second part. An array is a data structure that stores a collection of values of the same data type. Now, what do I mean here? So, stores a collection of values. So, when I mean collection of values, which means here again our values are marks. So, we are storing 100 of marks. So, that's collection of marks. So, we are storing collection of values of the same data type. So when I'm talking about same data type, which means that if I'm using an array to store integers, then the complete array should store integer only. If you see the graphical representation here we have 11 is an integer, 34 is an integer, 45 is an integer, 56 an integer, 78 an integer. So if in an array we are storing integers, then that in that particular array we'll be storing only integers. So we will see how do we ensure that an array will have integers, or how do we define that this particular array will have this data type only. But if I am saying that this array will have integers, then that particular array should have only integers. It should not have float, or it should not have strings. And if it is having strings, it should only have strings. Now, this particular part is clear. An array is a data structure that stores a collection of values of the same data type. Second part is stored in continuous memory location. So when I'm talking about continuous memory location, so what happens is that everything that we have variables that we store all of them in memory. So whenever we are creating an array, so here as you can say, let's say there are 15 elements. So all the elements have to be stored in continuous memory location. So if first element is stored at address, let's say address 1 in the memory, then second address has to be 2. So again this 1 and 2 differs. So what do we mean by continuous memory location? So by continuous memory location, we mean that if we are storing 10 elements, the 10 elements has to be stored one after the other. We won't get into that, we won't get too much into the how the array is stored in memory, because we want to keep it simple. Right now we just want to understand array first. So let's say if one particular element is stored in array 1 and second is stored in array 2, address 2, then third has to be stored in address 3, 4, 5, 6, like this. Or for that matter, if first element is stored at address 1001, second has to be stored at 1002, third has to be stored at 1003. So this particular difference, that second will be stored at 1002 or 1004, differentiates based on the data type. So what I'm trying to say here is that it cannot happen that if one is stored at 1001, other is stored at 1005, and the next one is stored at 2000. So a particular array, for a particular array, all the elements must be continuous. So this is an array. So it must not still be clear till now. We are just talking hypothetical things, right? So we need to know how do things work in ground. How do, let's say I know that now that what's an array, this is the graphical representation, it is a data structure. Still, we have many questions that need to be answered now, right? So the very first question is, how do I declare an array? So if we talk about the similarity of between array and variables, just like we declare a variable, we need to declare an array to use in our code, right? So first question is, how do I declare an array? The second question is, how do I create an array? So here by creating an array, I mean defining an array. So just like we declare and define a variable, when we declare a variable, we're just telling the compiler that, hey, I'm going to use this particular variable. And when I'm defining the variable, I'm actually keeping memory or reserving memory for that particular variable. Similarly, we need to declare a variable, we need to have, allocate memory to the array. So that is what I'm talking about, how to create an array, or how do I define an array. Next question is, how do I initialize elements of an array? Okay, So again, same similarity of variables, just like we have to give some values to the variable, right? So if I've said int x, I have to give some value to x. So similarly, how do we initialize elements of an array? And last, how do I access elements of an array? So if you can see that if I have done something like int x equal to 10, I can simply use the variable x throughout my program. But in array, we need to know that there are so many elements in an array. How do I access individual elements? So let's talk about each of these questions one by one. So very first thing is how to declare an array of integers. So this is an integer. This is how we declare one variable that is an integer. We have a data type and we have the name of the variable. This is how we declare an array. So as you can see, everything remains same. We just have these square brackets. So these square brackets can either be in this format, in the first format, or the second format. Both of them are true. So if you simply do int a, the compiler knows you're talking about a single variable. And if you do int bracket a or int a bracket, the compiler knows you're talking about an array. So this is how you declare an array of integers. So again, if you have to declare an array of strings or an array of floats, you will change the data type. In spite of int, there will be string. Similarly, things will change, right? Now, when we do int a, when we declare a integer, an array of integers, we have just declared it. We haven't created any array. We haven't reserved any memory for that particular array. So how do I do that? For creating an array of integers, so this is a bit different, from C, C++ in case of Java. So here, this is how we declare an element. So this is one way. This is another way. So both of them are same. It's just that the positioning of square bracket that we have. In first case, we have square bracket just after the int, and in another case it's different. Now let's try to understand what is this happening here. So here we have int a equal to new int 100. So what we are doing here, as you can see that you must have seen that we had several boxes. So we need to define that how many elements are we going to store. So we have just said that it's storing. So we have just said that it's storing collection of values, but there has to be some size, that in that collection there can be 100 elements or 1000 elements or 10,000 elements. So we define this here. Here we are saying that we are going to have 100 elements in an array. So new int, so again int is the data type. If it is going to be float, it will be float. So we have new int 100, which means I want to create an array that will store 100 elements. Now let's say here we are giving a 100 as a constant, right? It may happen that you want to take input from the user. So let's say again, you don't know how many, as a programmer, you don't know how many students could be there in the class. You want to know from the user that how many students could be there. So what you do is that you take the input from the user. Let's say you take an n, that these many students are going to be there. So it's going to be, let's say, n students in a class, and you want to create array for those n students. So in that case, this is how you will create the array, int a equal to new int n. So that was about declaring and creating an array. Now the next question is, how do I initialize an array of integers? So just like we initialize a variable, this is how we initialize. So let's try to see what are the things that's happening. So when we are doing int marks, again we are declaring the array, and we are just giving these elements 34, 45, 65, 90, 86, 50, 90. So what happens, there are various things that's happening here. So there are various things that are happening here. Number one, we are creating an array of size 7. So if you directly initialize an array of integers, you don't have to do that new int thing. You can, but this, when you directly do int marks equal to this initialization, this will create an array of size 7, and automatically the array will get the values. So this is how the array will be created, and size of the array once created cannot be changed. So you need to keep this in mind, that once you have created the array, size cannot be changed. So we have different, if you have that use case that you want to change the size, we have array list, another data structure, which we will talk further as we go for collections. So this is how we initialize an array of integers. Okay, I'll come back to that slide. Now the question is, I've initialized, I have put the values. So how do I access individual element? So let's say I want to print 34, which is the second element in the array. How do I do that? So now we will talk about access elements of an array. So now let's go on to see how do we access individual elements of an array. So we access elements of an array using an index. So for understanding this particular statement, we need to understand what is an index. So let's say I have created an array called marks. The marks will have 15 elements. So if we go on to see that how does this array looks, this is something like this. The one with the purple color is the value of the array. So now you must be thinking, why is it that all of these are having the value 0? So whenever you create a new array, if you're not assigning any value to them, it will have some values by default. So in this case, since it is an integer, it will have value as 0. If it would have been boolean, it would have value as false. So these are the default values. So if you don't assign any value to the array, it will have some value on its own. So these are the default values. In this case, it is a 0. Okay. Now, as you can see, here we have numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, increasing numbers till 14. These are called as the index. So the index starts from 0 and goes till n minus 1. So if an array has n elements, then the index will go from 0 to n minus 1. The first element is said to be at index 0. The second element is said to be at index 1. The third element is said to be at index 2. Similarly, it keeps on going until the 15th element, which is at index 14. Okay. Now, let's say I do something like this. This is how we are using the index to access elements of an array. So we have name of the array, we have square bracket, and we have the index. So in this case, in the first case, we are using the index 0 to access the first element. Here we are accessing the elements of an array to assign some value. So we are assigning the value 23 to the first element or the 0th index, and we are assigning the value 34 to the second element or the first index. So now this is how we can use index to access elements of an array for assigning some values. Now let's say I have to print the value of an individual element of an array. What will we do? We will use the index in the same manner. In this case, we are printing 0th index, which is the first element. Just don't get confused. It's very simple. You have first element at 0th index. So if it's you have to access ith element, you have to access it through the I minus 1 index. Okay. So after this particular operation, our array looks something like this. So the first element gets the value 23, the second element gets the value 34. And if we go back to the system.out.println, if we print this mark 0, we get the output as 23. So this is how we access elements of an array. So here what we have done, that we have accessed individual elements of an array, right? So we have to access 0th element. I do mark 0 equal to 23. Let's say I have to give some values, or I have to print all the elements of an array, or I have to give some value, assign some value to all the elements of the array. So we can have, the elements of an array from 10 to 1000 to 10,000, right? So we cannot just keep on accessing them individually. So in that case, we need loops to access the elements of the array from 0 to 1000. So let's see how do we use loops to access elements of an array using index. So let's say I have to assign some values in first case, right? So we are accessing elements of an array using loops. So we will have an array that starts from 0 and goes till n minus 1. So in this case, as you can see, that loop ends even before I is less than array.length, because we want our loop to run from 0 to array dot length minus 1 times. Okay, so here what we are doing, we are learning our loop from 0 to array dot length minus 1, and we are, in spite of putting some constant element, constant number inside the bracket, we are putting I. So when I is 0, we will have our marks 0 is equal to 0. When I will be 1, we will have marks 1 is equal to 10. Similarly, when I will be 2, we have marks 2 is equal to 20. So this is how we can access elements of an array to assign some values. In order to print the values, we can do the same thing. We can access the elements in the same manner. It's just that we'll be using the print statement. So this is how our array will look after this first operation. The 0th element will have the value as 0. The first element will have the value as 10. The second element will have the value as 20. Similarly, in this case, you can see that we have index till 15, which means that we have 16 elements in this particular array. So an alternative to this loop, this is a for loop, right? So here we are giving the length of the array, we are giving the starting index, and this is how we are doing things. So there is a kind of complication here. You have to calculate the length of the array, you have to give this I is equal to 0. So a simple version for accessing elements of the array is known as for each loop. Let's see that. So this is something like this. For each loop is also known as for each element. The loop goes something like this. We have for element, then we have a colon, and then we have name of the array. This marks is the name of the array, and this element is something which keeps on changing. So as you can see that you don't have to give the number of elements, you don't have to give the starting index, and you don't have any counter to take care of in this case. So as the loop keeps on changing, that things happens beneath. As the loop keeps on changing, that element keeps on incrementing. So that's why I say for each element in marks. So when you run the loop starts with having element as value 11, then 11 gets printed, then loop keeps on changing, then loop gets updated, element has the value 34, 34 gets printed, then again loop gets updated, element gets the value 45, 45 gets printed. Similarly, the value of element keeps on changing as we keep on going as we keep on going ahead with the array, right? And this is how each element gets printed. So this is something called as for each loop. We use this in case of arrays. So that was some of the basics of array that we talked about today. As I said, that array is very important and you will be solving lots of problems using arrays.